we've got John Brown from Don't Cry Wolf. And John, I love his bio. John is a trucker. Now, John is a dad of two, a husband to one, and the founder of Don't Cry Wolf, B Corp certified brand activism agency. He is a relentless advocate of business being a tremendous part of solving some of society's biggest problems. Look, John, you and me agree, right? Business has caused these challenges, but enterprise is the only way out of them. And it's hard to say that sometimes. He's also an ambassador for the B Corp movement and advised brands on their ESG approach. He's worked with such brands as Virgin, Green Chef, LV, Flight Club, and Meridian on campaigns and strategies. Most importantly, he has the best taste in interior furnishings of anybody on this call. John, over to you, brother.
What an amazing intro. Can I just say, I've never felt so fluid. I could literally feel the toxins leaving my body as you were doing that stretching. And I definitely sort of got into sort of a bit of a 90s techno rave situation as well, which I thoroughly enjoyed. So thanks for that, mate.
Well, John, if you ever want more, there is a very 1980s flow, like a body pop flow that I do, which who knew that the body poppers of the early 80s were actually Qigong masters, but they really were.
Love it. I'm there with you spiritually and physically, buddy. Let's do this.
Get out your way. Thanks, John.
Cheers, man. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in. I must say the interior furnishings that you see is courtesy of the magnificent Leap team. So I'm in their offices right now. We share the same space, but their one looks far better than mine. So I've decided to nick their backdrop. Yeah, I'm John Brown. I am the founder of Don't Cry Wolf. We're a brand activism agency. And there's a few disclaimers that I'm going to kind of run through before I crack onto the presentation. I've got a few slides I'm going to run through. So a few things that are definitely going to happen, and I apologize far in advance of them. Number one, despite working in comms my entire sort of adult life, I have a terrible grasp of the English language. So to kind of compensate that, I will swear profusely throughout this, and I apologize in advance if that offends anyone. I can promise you it's just from a place of love and complete ignorance as well, but that it is definitely going to happen. I'm 17 and a half stone, and some people say that I sort of look like a pirate who's discovered complex carbohydrates, but I will sweat as well during this. I will absolutely sweat profusely during this this presentation. That's just animation and love pouring out of me. And the final thing is, I'm going to take some mad tangents, but please do stick with me on this journey. I will go off into a mad little space. It might end somewhere, it might not, I don't know. But I'm hoping that we will go there together and we'll enjoy this experience thoroughly. So let me share this screen. Let me see how I undo this. I hope we can all see that. Maybe. Matt, you're on my screen. Nod fury.
You've accidentally muted yourself, John.
Sorry, there we go. So what's my presentation about today? Well, I wrote this, and my pitch was, you know what, guys, Laura, Matt, I'm going to do a presentation around brand activism for good, and that's going to be focused in on kind of why brands should have a role to play, a really serious role to play in addressing some of the most important issues our world faces, and why that's okay. And then I thought, actually, what this has ended up going to be is this sort of talk on why I fucking hate manifestos. And that is going to end up sort of drifting into this kind of discussion. And why I'm saying this is because I want to make sure that the output from what we do at Goodfest and beyond, it is really, really action orientated and critical to the success, our joint success at answering some of this world's sort of biggest questions. So if it does drift into this territory, I've pre-warned you. Let's first start with some definitions, because that's fun and enjoyable, and it means that we're all on the same level playing field. So what do I mean by brand activism? I mean using the power of a brand to do more than sell shit to people, and instead to try and also agitate some positive change out of humanity, perhaps even plug a couple of gaps where government or society has not filled, and to do something where they're taking their collective power, people, resources, and saying, hey, do you know what, maybe we can do more than flog something. Maybe today is going to be the day when actually we're going to answer a question that society's been asking for a while, and we're going to give it a go. And I think it's a tremendously powerful tool for a brand to get engaged in. What do I mean by the climate crisis? That's the imminent threat of highly dangerous, irreversible changes to the global climate due to man-made damage. That's what I mean by the climate crisis. And I talk about the climate crisis a lot. I use that quite actionable language around crisis rather than change. I feel change is a touch passive for where we are right now. So when I refer to the climate crisis, this is what I mean. And when I refer to brand professionals, I mean anyone being paid to provide brand advice or consultancy. I don't care whether you're a designer, a comms professional, a marketeer, whatever it might be. If someone's giving you cash to say, what shall I do with my business? That's who I'm talking about. So we've set the parameters. I've given you your warnings for the type of person I am. Let's go into some truth bombs. Okay, the shit bit. You know, we've talked about this a lot, but it's probably worthwhile just setting the backdrop again. You know, about a 5% chance right now of hitting a UN target for remaining below 2 degrees of warming. That's not great. And actually, what Mark said was a superb bit of an example as to how we need to alter and adjust our thinking around China. So actually, China is most definitely leading away in this. So whilst we all pat ourselves on the back and say how magnificent we're doing, while simultaneously pointing loosely to the east and saying, oh yeah, it's all their fault, actually they're spending more on renewables, more on advancement technology than any of the other Western nations. But what we're still not seeing is this collective drive towards addressing this shit bit of news. So that's the backdrop. That's why it's fundamentally important that we have this cognizant in our minds constantly, because it's getting closer and closer to a point where it starts to get a bit squeaky bum. It starts to get a bit nerve-wracking. I think one of the other things that I want to touch on is misinformation fuels both denialism and alarmism. And I'd say this fairly, I suppose, controversial statement that I think Greta Thunberg and Nigel Farage both have a lot to answer for when it comes to creating a climate of separatism and fear and at some points actually exclusion. If we are going to address this discussion, this issue, this point, this existential threat that we all believe that we face, we have to do it as one. We have to do it in unison. We can't pick different sides. We can't work on an identity politics sort of basis. There has to be a point in time where we are working collectively for the common good. And we have to embrace every person from every walk of life in order to make that sort of change effective, because it is a systemic change that we're looking for. It's not just individual sort of preachy changes that we can all sort of point to and say, well, at least they're sorting it out. This has to be done by all of us. And I think one of the things that brands need to be very, very cognizant of is that they don't have to necessarily pick a side and say, we're going to fuel one of these two fires. What they need to do is start thinking, how can we bring more unheard, unrepresented voices into the conversation through the power of what we've got behind us as an organization? I think that's a far more interesting and exciting question for a brand to ask itself. Declaring an emergency. So this is intent versus action. I told you there was going to be a bit where I worry about talking about too many manifestos. Declaring something, clicking something, adhering to something is not the same as actually addressing it and taking action. And it's not, you know, I can't move today for the amount of individuals or organizations that are literally breathlessly coming up to me to try and declare another climate emergency or share with me another one of their net zero commitments that they may or may not reach in 50 years' time. This is all wonderful intent, guys, but I need to see some action. We have to start moving into the territory of action. And whilst it might be deeply satisfying for that one moment to click on something and say, yes, I believe in this, there is a fundamental difference. And in fact, I ask you this. I don't know of anyone in the world who I can come up to right now and say, would you like to make this product cleaner and more efficient for the planet? And for them to turn around and say, no, I'd like it to be dirtier and worse. But then ask them, what are you prepared to give up in order to make that product cleaner and more efficient for the planet? And that's the big, fundamental, ballsy, hairy, filthy question that we've got to ask ourselves, and that's what pushes us away from intent and into action. We can't just sit around declaring things and making magnificent commitments that may or may not be measured in 30 or 40 years' time. We have to start working out what action are we going to take and what are we prepared to sacrifice along the way. And I just want to give you a very quick example of this. It's a magnificent thing. Hope for Justice. In 2018, Boohoo became members of this charity, Hope for Justice. They sent out press releases around the Slave Free Alliance and support our modern day slavery, due diligence. It's plastered all over their website. It's part and parcel of their brand identity that they will not do things that are naughty for people. And then in 2020, Boohoo were facing modern slavery investigation after finding out that most of their Leicestershire workers were paid as little as £3.50 an hour. This is the difference between intent and action. It's all well and good to turn around and say, we commit to this idea of a world without slavery. It's very different to say we also commit to the idea of perhaps affecting our profit margin by X percentage because we feel as though people should be paid a fair living wage. And I think this is the mentality that we need to move away from. A manifesto is all well and good, but if it needs to have action, it needs to have something more than intent for it to be something truly powerful. I'm going to pause as I can't see these slides, sorry. Can you guys see the slides? Oh, okay, and there we go. I think one of the most fundamental bits that we need to be cognizant of as well is the fact that growth can't come at the expense of nature any longer. Well, I think one of the things that I find quite interesting and perhaps a slight sort of worrying element as part and parcel of humanity is that we haven't really applied a cost to sort of nature and natural capital. You know, we measure things like on GDP and we all kind of get very, very excited about where do we sit in the GDP league tables. One thing that GDP doesn't take into account by any stretch of the imagination, in fact, not at all, is to reach that level of gross productivity, which is a sort of slightly bizarre metric that says how much value does Matt Hocking produce? How much value does Mark Shaler produce to this economy? What that doesn't take into account is how much value did they produce at the expense of natural capital. And what I'd love to start seeing brands do, and probably the most brand activism-y sort of thing that an organization can do is start saying, this is how much it costs us to make a product or a service or deliver something from a monetary perspective. And by the way, this is how much we nicked off the planet to make it happen as well. What a wonderful set of a bit of transparency that would be, that we could all make decisions then, not just on the amount of cost that went into the manufacturing process, but the amount of natural capital we also had to give up as humanity in order to make sure that we could get that iPhone in our hands at a fairly cheap rate. I think there's some ridiculous stat out there, which feels right, actually, that if you took into account all of the cost factors from slavery through to mining, through to all those other bits and pieces, the actual true cost of an iPhone would be something closer to 9 grand than the 900 quid that you pay, if you really took into account the sort of the different natural factors that go into making it. So it's something to be a bit more cognizant of, I think, as we move forward in our brand activism journey. So how and what are the roles then that we can all play as a brand? And what are the different roles that I feel as though a brand can play in this sort of discussion and in this debate? And I've kind of whittled them down into 4 sort of distinct areas. First and foremost is this idea of the energizer. So one of the things that a brand can do is influence stakeholders, get energized, motivated around addressing the climate crisis. You don't have to have all the answers as a brand. You can just say, hey, do you know what? This is a pretty fucking important topic, and I'd love to see a little bit of energy, time, discussion devoted towards it. That would be a tremendous position for a brand to adopt. Not turning around and saying, hey, I've sold everything, by the way, look at this, I sold it all through my boardroom, thank you so very much. And instead turning around and going, do you know what, it's really, really weird that we're sort of spending a lot of time talking about a bunch of people crossing the channel in a dinghy and not necessarily addressing some perhaps more intense systemic change that's taking place in and around the world. And maybe that would be a wonderful position for a brand to adopt, is this idea of an energizer, where the brand is constantly poking these stakeholders, getting them motivated and energized around addressing the climate crisis. Next one is a sage. It's a particularly interesting brand persona that can be adopted here from a brand activism perspective. But I'd love for more brands to have a more deeper knowledge of the climate crisis as a whole, more kind of granular understanding of what a emission looks like. Perhaps it would be interesting for them to, simply reflect on what's taking place in the discussion and the trends and the key points, the key scientific areas, and actually just provide a bit of a reflection on it. You don't have to do anything more active than that as a brand. You don't always have to go and take to the streets with a placard. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you as a brand used some of your resources to say, hey, do you know what? We're going to point you in the direction of information and understanding in the latest discussions and trends around the climate crisis. Something that I felt, Patagonia did fairly well for a while, and perhaps still does to an extent, is that if you go onto its homepage, most of the time it's pointing you towards a discussion or an area that it feels as though you should pay a bit of an attention to. And I think the Sage persona is a really smart one for a brand to potentially adopt. If we move on from Sage, I think one of the other key sort of brand personas that we can, dear me, that we can adopt is this idea of the critic. It's a cool time on bullshit. I know it's not a potentially friendly attitude or persona for a brand to adopt, but it's one that's, I think, deeply important. I'm fairly tired of seeing quite a lot of negligent commitments being made or declarations being made. One recently really, really got my goat when Loganair announced that it was going to fly carbon neutral because everyone was going to pay an extra £1 for their ticket price, and that was going to go towards some obscure offsetting scheme, which they had no idea what that was, and didn't even have the courtesy to present what the offset was in its entirety. I feel as though brands need to sort of call each other out a touch more when things like that happen, because that's not useful for anyone. That's creating a sort of air of solving a big problem when in actual fact, what you're really doing is fueling a little bit more consumerism and telling people, don't worry, it's okay. That quid's being spent on planting a tree that may or may not grow in 100 years. That's not quite right. And actually, if more brands came out as critics and as sort of calling each other out a touch, I think that would be quite a useful thing for the wider world. One of the final brand personas that I think we can adopt is this idea of a coach. And that is about ensuring that improvement is perpetual and not just a flash in the pan campaign. I'm really worried that some of the great stuff, some of the exciting stuff that we're seeing emerge from brands is going to sort of stop when it kind of becomes less sexy, I suppose, when it becomes less kind of interesting, or when people lose their desire to share it on social media. I think one of the things that we must do is is to ensure that this isn't just flash in the pan stuff, that these campaigns build into movements that build into a perpetual sense of actually trying to solve a crisis. I think we do have a problem ultimately, though, which we should all be addressing as creatives. And this is it. What we need is confidence, clarity, and commitment. That will lead to positive action. But I think what we have is fear, confusion, and recklessness. And what that leads to is misinformation. And the reason being is that we're kind of fearful of what the other side might think. And I think we need to be mindful of the fact that transparency creates fearlessness. So if you're going to do something, anything in the brand activism space, make sure that you're doing so in a way that is completely transparent to the outside world. Because even if you get it wrong, it's absolutely fine if you show your journey, if you show your workings out, like in that GCSE maths test, right? If you show your workings out, you still get marks. I think being transparent will create that air of fearlessness and confidence. Getting smart about this debate is absolutely essential. If you are a marketer or a creative and you're walking into a boardroom to have a discussion about brand activism or a campaign that is going to touch on this debate, make sure that you know your onions when you get to it. Otherwise, you'll end up in a confused space, and that will cause a bit of fear. That will cause a bit of recklessness. And then into this recklessness space as well, please don't push stuff out willy-nilly. Like, commit to something. I'd much rather see brands and organizations commit to solving 1, 2, 3 areas, which are really, really tangible and identifiable, than trying to turn around and say, do you know what? We're going to solve carbon emissions. What? On your own? It's madness, right? Let's make sure that we're not being reckless with our commitments. Let's make sure we're doing something that feels within grasp of humanity. And I think that will start to give us that confidence and clarity that we need. Just to be aware of our own misinformation. I don't know how long I've got. I'm going to carry on for the next 4 hours, by the way. And then I'm going to go into a sort of little dance, which I've written for you all. how we need to be aware of our own misinformation as creators when we enter this debate, and also as brands coming at this sort of idea of getting involved in the climate crisis from a brand activism perspective. One of the things that we have to move away from is this idea of net zero washing. And again, this is where we get to the sort of manifesto issues that I'm sort of going to start to creep in. You know, net zero commitments have doubled in less than a year, and yet only 8% of companies have provided interim results on 30-year commitments. Okay, this is the clear example of the difference between a commitment and action. We have to start thinking, perhaps the best thing is not to declare another emergency with another organization and put that logo on our website. Perhaps it's about what action can we take now within our organization to make a difference, to make a tangible difference, and then report on it a little later on down the line. If you are going to make a commitment as a brand activist, make damn well sure that you are showing you're working out, that you are providing interim results and check-ins so people can see that that commitment is manifesting into actual, genuine action. Oh, I don't know why this keeps happening. I apologize. Offsetting fear. Okay, one of the things that brands are doing more and more regularly, we heard that bad example of Logan Air, is talking about offsetting. You know, and saying, well, actually, we've offset this, so everything else is fine. You know, be mindful, be cognizant of what you're talking about when you get into that discussion. And as part of that kind of reduce, reuse, offset, it's powerful, it's right, it's okay. But it needs to be pointed in the right direction. It needs to be done carefully, mindfully. It needs to be done with the right sorts of partners. This is where I'm going to get onto a massive high horse around this. Don't go and make another fucking bamboo coffee cup. Please, I beg of you, don't do this. Eco-consumerism is not going to help at this point in time. And I can't stress enough, you releasing another organic cotton t-shirt as a brand is not going to address the issue. I think one of the biggest embarrassments that the PR, comms and branding industry has done over the last sort of 10, maybe 15 years is to convince us all that if we make a switch from a plastic toothbrush to a bamboo toothbrush, we're having the most enormous impact on carbon emissions. We are not. So eco-consumerism is not the answer. What is the answer, from my perspective, is absolute systemic change. Let's stop putting pressure on people and saying, hey, why are you using that plastic bag? Where in actual fact, we should be asking corporations, organizations, big entities, hey, why do we have that plastic bag in the first place? Why are we not capable of disposing of that appropriately? Let's start to move away from making a consumer feel intensely guilty every single day and convincing them to spend a few extra quid with us than a few extra quid with someone else, and start thinking about what systemic role we can play. Final myth in all of this, I think, is that the idea that big business is bad. Big business is absolutely crucial. Much more can be done in unison rather than in isolation. Why? Because they hold a lot more fucking money and a lot more position within the corridors of power. So what can we do as creatives? We can make sure that at every stage where we're being asked by either big business or getting together as small or independent individuals or organizations, that we are turning around and saying, this is what we should be doing first and foremost. This is what we expect of these organizations. And this is what our relationship that we want from you to look like. This can be an open, honest, important discussion that we have to have alongside big business. It cannot be big business is bad, let's go over here. That model will not work, and it will bite us in the arse when we realize that we don't have the resources that we need to do it effectively. So working in unison with them is crucial. And actually our role as individuals is to penetrate those little corridors of power within big business and be a kind of activists from the inside out. They're full of them. It's if we just knew that we existed each other and got together as a collective to do this, we would absolutely drive change from the big business outwards. So I think I've fairly reached the end of my discussion and my mad rant. I'm going to have a sip of water.
That was amazing. That was, I mean, I'm sat here cheering, right? Everything you've said resonates really strongly and follows my philosophy. We do no good by castigating or shunning those players that are going to take us further, right? Which is probably those with the greatest scale. And it feels unpalatable to be working with big business sometimes. I get that, but that's where the change is going to come. And you're right, you know, you've got to use a cotton shopper approximately 200 times before it's better than 200 plastic carrier bags. Stop making more stuff to make you feel better, and stop trying to blame somebody else. This is really, really intrinsic stuff.